Look at yourself in the mirror. Go ahead, picture it. The shape of your face, your hands, the way your body is built. Now here's the mind-bending part. If you could somehow stand next to a human from 200,000 years ago, you'd look almost identical. Same height, roughly, same bone structure, same brain size. You could swap clothes and nobody would notice the difference. But look around at the world you live in. Smartphones, airplanes, cities with millions of people stacked in buildings that scrape the sky. We've invented antibiotics, split the atom, and landed robots on Mars. We've transformed this entire planet. We've changed everything except ourselves. That's the mystery we're going to unravel tonight. Why did humans stop changing physically? What happened to evolution? Because here's what doesn't make sense. Every other species keeps adapting to their environment. Fish develop new colors. Birds evolve different beak shapes. Bacteria become resistant to our drugs in real time. Evolution never stops. So why did it stop for us? 200,000 years. That's how long modern humans, Homo sapiens, have existed, with basically the same body we have today. Sure, there are small variations. Some populations adapted to high altitudes, others developed different skin tones. But fundamentally, we're frozen in time. A human from the late Stone Age would have the same physical capabilities, the same strength, the same senses, the same brain structure as you do right now. Yet in those same 200,000 years, we went from hunting with stone-tipped spears to hunting for Wi-Fi signals. Something broke the rules of evolution. Something made us different from every other species on Earth. And the answer isn't what you think. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where are you right now and what time is it. I love checking and seeing like Tokyo at sunrise, Toronto at midnight, all at the same time. It's wild. Now, back to our mystery. For millions of years before we became Homo sapiens, human evolution was fast, incredibly fast. Our ancestors were changing dramatically every few 100,000 years. Bigger brains, different teeth, taller bodies, better walking. The fossil record shows constant, relentless physical transformation. Then, around 200,000 years ago, everything just stopped. We became physically static while our world became infinitely dynamic. It's like evolution hit pause on our bodies but forgot to hit pause on everything else. We're living in a paradox. The most successful species in Earth's history, the one that reshaped the entire planet, and we did it all with Stone Age hardware. Your body right now, the one getting comfortable as you listen to this, is optimized for a world that no longer exists. A world of running down prey across African savannas, of climbing trees to escape predators, of processing raw food and surviving without medicine or shelter. Yet here you are, using that ancient machine to navigate a world of screens and schedules and processed food and climate-controlled buildings. How is that possible? Tonight, we're going on a journey through time to understand this frozen moment in human evolution. We'll discover why our ancestors stopped changing physically, right when they seemed to need adaptation most. We'll explore the revolutionary shift that made bodies less important than something else entirely. We'll uncover how humans found a cheat code that let us skip millions of years of physical evolution. And here's what makes this perfect for falling asleep. The story is vast. It spans hundreds of thousands of years. It moves slowly like evolution itself. There's no rush, no urgency, just the gentle unfolding of the most important transformation in human history. The moment we stopped becoming different bodies and started becoming different minds. The answer involves catastrophes survived, technologies discovered, and a complete rewiring of how evolution itself works for our species. It's a story written in bones and genes and artifacts scattered across continents. A mystery that scientists are still piecing together. But the most incredible part? This pause in our physical evolution might not be permanent. Right now, in ways we're only beginning to understand, humans might be on the verge of changing again. Not through natural selection this time, through something far stranger and faster. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning. Let's go back to the last time humans really changed. Back to when our bodies were still being sculpted by the raw forces of survival. Back before we found another way. So when exactly did we stop changing? When did the human body reach its final form, the blueprint that every person alive today carries? The answer takes us back to a time when the world looked radically different, when multiple species of humans walked the earth, and when the bodies we now take for granted were still works in progress. 300,000 years ago, in what is now Morocco, something new appeared in the fossil record. A skull. At first glance, it doesn't look that different from earlier human ancestors, but examine it closely. Run your fingers along the contours, measure the proportions, and you start to see something revolutionary. The face is flatter, pulled back under the skull instead of jutting forward. The brain case is higher, more rounded. The brow ridges, those heavy bone shelves that had dominated human faces for millions of years, are reduced to subtle arches. This is Jebel Ehud, the oldest known Homo sapiens fossil, and it represents the moment when our species, anatomically speaking, enters the world stage. But here's what's fascinating. This person, this early Homo sapiens from 300,000 years ago, they wouldn't quite fit into a modern crowd. Put them in contemporary clothes, teach them a modern language, and something would still seem off. Not wrong exactly, but different. Subtly, unmistakably different. Their skull is longer from front to back, less globular than ours. The face, while flatter than their ancestors, still projects forward more than modern human faces. The body, based on what we can reconstruct from fragmentary remains, is more robust. Heavier bones, thicker joint surfaces, muscle attachment points that suggest extraordinary physical strength. These weren't people who went to the gym. They were people whose daily survival required a level of physical exertion that would hospitalize most modern humans. For the next 100,000 years, human bodies continued to evolve, continued to refine the basic Homo sapiens template. The fossil record shows a clear trend. Skulls becoming more rounded, faces becoming flatter, bodies becoming more gracile. Not weaker necessarily, but more efficient. Less bone mass devoted to pure structural strength, more emphasis on endurance and fine motor control. By 200,000 years ago, we see fossils from East Africa, Ethiopia specifically, that look remarkably modern. Omokibish, Herto. These skulls could almost pass for contemporary humans. The proportions are right, the brain case is properly globular, the face sits flat beneath the forehead, but again look closely and you see differences. The bones are still thicker, the brow ridges, while reduced, are still more prominent than in most modern populations. The overall skeleton remains more robust. What was driving these changes? The simple answer is natural selection, but that doesn't really explain anything. We need to understand what specific pressures were shaping human bodies during this critical period. And the answer appears to be diet, technology, and social organization, all working together in a feedback loop that would ultimately lock in the modern human form. Let's start with the skull, because that's where the most dramatic changes occurred. human skulls from 300,000 years ago to about 50,000 years ago show a consistent pattern of change. The face shrinks, the jaw becomes smaller, the teeth reduce in size, the skull becomes more rounded, less elongated. These aren't random variations, they're responses to how humans were processing food. For millions of years, human ancestors had needed massive jaws and powerful chewing muscles. They were eating raw or partially cooked foods that required serious mechanical processing. Your jaw was a tool, maybe your most important tool, but as human technology advanced, as cooking techniques became more sophisticated, as tools for cutting and grinding became standardized, the jaw became less critical. You didn't need massive molars to grind raw plant material if you could cook it first. You didn't need powerful jaw muscles if you could cut meat with stone tools before eating it. Natural. Selection responded accordingly. Individuals with smaller jaws and teeth weren't at a disadvantage anymore. In fact, they might have had slight advantages. Smaller jaws meant less energy, devoted to growing and maintaining massive facial structures. Less bone mass meant lower nutritional requirements. Over thousands of generations, the human face literally shrank. But there's a catch, and it's one we're still dealing with today. Our jaws shrunk faster than our teeth did. Modern humans have the same number of teeth as our ancestors from 1 million years ago, but we have much less jaw space to fit them in. That's why wisdom teeth are such a problem. That's why orthodontics is a multi-billion-dollar industry. We're living with bodies that change too fast, that adapted to cooking and tool use so quickly that the different parts didn't have time to adjust proportionally. The skull changes weren't just about the face, though. The most important transformation was happening inside, in the shape of the brain case itself. Early Homo sapiens had elongated skulls, stretched from front to back, but over time, the skull became more globular, more spherical. The back of the skull, the occipital region, became less prominent. The forehead became more vertical, less sloped. This isn't just cosmetic. The shape of your skull reflects the shape of your brain, and the shape of your brain influences how it functions. Modern human brains are remarkably spherical compared to those of our ancestors. This globular shape is associated with expanded frontal and parietal lobes, the regions involved in abstract reasoning, social cognition, and complex planning. Neanderthals, by comparison, retained the more elongated skull shape of earlier humans. Their brains were actually larger than ours on average, sometimes significantly so. But the shape was different, more stretched front to back, less rounded. The occipital region at the back of the skull, what physical anthropologists call the occipital bun, was much more prominent. This meant their brain volume was distributed differently, more emphasis on visual processing and motor control, possibly less on the abstract reasoning and social cognition that define modern human behavior. And here's where the comparison between modern humans and Neanderthals becomes really instructive, because they show us what we didn't become. Neanderthals evolved from the same post-bottleneck population as modern humans. They carried the same chromosomal fusion. They had the same basic genetic toolkit. But 400,000 years of evolution in Ice Age Europe shaped them into something distinct. Everything about Neanderthal anatomy screams cold adaptation and physical power. Their bodies were incredibly robust. Short, stocky builds that minimized surface area and conserved heat. Massive muscle attachment points indicating strength that would dwarf modern Olympic athletes. Bone density that suggests they could withstand impacts that would shatter modern human bones. Their faces were adapted for extreme cold. Massive nasal openings to warm and humidify freezing air. forward projecting faces that created more internal volume for air processing. Even their eye sockets were larger, possibly to accommodate bigger eyes adapted to the longer, darker winters of Ice Age Europe. Modern humans took a different path. When Homo sapiens finally emerged from Africa around 60,000 years ago, we were built for endurance and adaptability rather than raw power. More graceful skeletons, longer limbs relative to body size, lighter bones. We couldn't match Neanderthal strength, but we could run longer, adapt faster to different climates, and modify our behavior more quickly when circumstances changed. The really crucial period, the time when our bodies locked into their modern form, appears to be between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. The fossil record from this period shows something remarkable. The pace of physical change slows dramatically. After 200,000 years of steady anatomical refinement, after countless generations of natural selection, shaping smaller faces and rounder skulls, everything stabilizes. Fossils from 50,000 years ago look essentially identical to modern humans. The skull proportions match, the skeletal gracility matches, the dental structure matches. You could take someone from 50,000 years ago, give them a shower and modern clothes, and they disappear into a crowd. This is the end point. This is when we reached our current physical form. But why did it stop? What happened 50,000 years ago that made further physical evolution unnecessary or impossible? The answer appears to be behavioral modernity, that package of cognitive abilities that defines our species. Art, symbolic thinking, complex language, systematic tool manufacture, long-distance trade networks. All of these exploded in the archaeological record right around this time. Suddenly humans weren't adapting to their environment through physical changes anymore. They were adapting through culture. Living in a cold climate? Don't wait hundreds of thousands of years to evolve body hair and short limbs like the Neanderthals did. Just make better clothing. Facing new prey animals? Don't evolve specialized hunting anatomy. Just invent better weapons. Need to process tougher foods? Don't grow bigger teeth. Just develop better cooking techniques. The fossils tell us this story clearly. After 50,000 years ago, you see enormous variation in human material culture, tools and ornaments and living structures changing rapidly. But the bodies remained constant. The same basic skeletal structure from Africa to Australia to Europe. Regional variations in skin color, hair texture, face shape, yes, but the underlying architecture identical. There were still minor adaptations happening, of course. Populations at high altitudes developed genetic changes that helped them process oxygen more efficiently. Northern populations evolved lighter skin to maximize vitamin D production in low-light environments. Some groups developed lactose tolerance after domesticating dairy animals. But these are minor tweaks, genetic adjustments rather than major anatomical overhauls. The big changes, the transformation from heavy-browed, robust-bodied archaic humans to gracile, flat-faced modern humans, all of that was done by 50,000 years ago. We had reached the endpoint of our physical evolution. From here on out, we would change the world instead of changing ourselves. And there's something both liberating and slightly unsettling about this. Every human alive today, all 8 billion of us, carries essentially the same body plan as our ancestors from 50,000 years ago. We haven't gotten taller as a species, though nutrition has allowed individuals to reach their genetic potential. We haven't gotten smarter, though education has allowed us to use our existing intelligence more effectively. Our brains aren't bigger, our bones aren't stronger, our senses aren't sharper. We are, physically speaking, frozen in time. Stone Age bodies living in a space age world, and yet somehow with these unchanged bodies we've transformed the planet, built civilizations, created technologies, explored the cosmos, all without waiting for evolution to give us better tools. The last great physical changes happened before recorded history, before agriculture, before cities, before writing. They happened when we were still hunter-gatherers, still living in small bands, still struggling to survive in a world full of predators and dangers. And then they stopped. The human body reached its final form just as the human mind was preparing to reshape the world. For millions of years the game was simple. Environment throws challenge at species, species adapts or dies. Bodies change, survival of the fittest, evolution doing its slow, grinding work. But then, around 10,000 years ago, humans broke the rules. We stopped playing the game altogether. Here's what happened. After surviving the bottleneck, spreading across continents, developing into multiple species, and eventually emerging as the sole surviving human lineage, modern humans were still living as hunter-gatherers. Small mobile groups following animal migrations, tracking seasonal plant resources, constantly moving to wherever food was available, and their bodies reflected this lifestyle. Archaeological evidence from 15,000 years ago shows humans who would make modern athletes look soft. Skeletal analysis reveals bone density comparable to professional marathon runners. Muscle attachment points on bones indicate strength, levels that required constant physical exertion to maintain. These people walked an average of 10 to 15 miles every day, not as exercise, just as normal life. They climbed, ran, carried heavy loads across rough terrain, pulled bowstrings with forces exceeding 100 pounds. Their bodies were survival machines, honed by hundreds of thousands of years of selection pressure for physical capability. Their jaws were massive, teeth perfectly aligned, capable of processing tough, fibrous foods. No wisdom tooth problems, no crowded incisors, no need for braces, because the people who couldn't chew properly starved. Natural selection doesn't mess around with dental health. Their immune systems were different too. Constantly exposed to parasites, variable food sources and environmental pathogens, they had developed robust defenses. Not perfect, people still died of disease, but their baseline resistance was extraordinary compared to what would come later. Then somebody, somewhere, probably in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, made a discovery that would change everything. They noticed that if you saved some seeds from wild wheat and deliberately planted them near your camp, you didn't have to wander quite so far to find food next season. It sounds simple. It sounds obvious. But it was the most revolutionary idea in human history. Because here's the thing about that first planting. It wasn't just a new food acquisition strategy. It was the moment humans stopped adapting to the world and started making the world adapt to us. For the first time, instead of changing our bodies to fit the environment, we changed the environment to fit our bodies. The transition wasn't sudden. For thousands of years, humans practiced what archaeologists call proto-agriculture, partial farming, supplemented by hunting and gathering. Groups would plant crops in favourable areas, then move on, returning months later to harvest whatever had survived. Gradually, over generations, the balance shifted. As people got better at selecting seeds, understanding growing seasons and protecting their crops, farming became more reliable than foraging. More importantly, it became more productive. An acre of cultivated wheat could feed more people than an acre of wild grassland. Not better nutrition, we'll get to that problem, but more calories per unit of land. This created a feedback loop that would transform humanity. More food meant populations could grow larger. Larger populations meant more labor to work the fields. More labor meant more land could be cultivated. More cultivation meant even more food. Within just a few thousand years, areas that had supported maybe 100 hunter-gatherers were feeding thousands of farmers. But there was a cost, and that cost was written into our skeletons. When archaeologists compare bones from hunter-gatherers to early farmers, the differences are shocking. Farmers were shorter, sometimes by 4 to 6 inches. Their bone density was lower, indicating less physical activity and possibly poorer nutrition. Their teeth tell an even more disturbing story. Suddenly, you see massive increases in cavities, abscesses, and tooth loss. The carbohydrate-rich diet of cultivated grains was rotting teeth faster than natural selection could adapt. Jaw size began decreasing within just a few generations, not because of genetic changes, we'll get to those, but because softer, processed foods didn't require the same chewing forces. Without that mechanical stress, jaws didn't develop to full size during childhood. This is why modern humans need orthodontics. We're eating processed foods with jaws designed for tough, fibrous hunter-gatherer diets. The skeleton changes went deeper. Joint diseases that were rare in hunter-gatherers became common in farming populations. Arthritis, back problems, repetitive stress injuries from grinding grain and hoeing fields. Evidence of nutritional deficiencies shows up everywhere. Iron deficiency, vitamin D deficiency, protein deficiency. Hunter-gatherers had eaten an incredibly varied diet. Dozens of plant species, multiple animal sources, insects, fish, whatever was available. Farmers ate mostly wheat or rice or corn depending on region. Reliable calories, yes, but missing crucial nutrients. Disease exploded. This might be the most important consequence of all. Hunter-gatherer bands of 20 to 50 people couldn't sustain epidemic diseases. Pathogens would burn through the small population and die out. But farming villages of thousands, living in permanent settlements surrounded by domesticated animals drinking from wells contaminated by human waste, these were perfect breeding grounds for infectious disease. Measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, plague, the diseases that would kill hundreds of millions throughout history, they all emerged during the agricultural transition. Zoonotic diseases jumping from domesticated animals to humans. Crowd diseases requiring large dense populations to maintain transmission. Vector-borne diseases, thriving in the artificial water sources and waste accumulation of permanent settlements. So let's be clear about what happened. Humans discovered agriculture, and within a few thousand years we became shorter, weaker, sicker, and more disease-prone than our hunter-gatherer ancestors. By every measure of individual health and physical capability, farming made us worse. And yet, we didn't go back. We couldn't go back. Because agriculture had one overwhelming advantage. It supported far more people. A hunter-gatherer band might have 40 members. A farming village could have 4,000. When those populations came into conflict, numbers won. Simple as that. The farmer's advantage wasn't stronger individuals, it was more individuals. But here's where the evolutionary story gets really interesting. Under normal circumstances, these new selective pressures should have driven rapid evolution. Populations adapting to sedentary life, to grain-based diets, to disease-rich environments. And there was some evolution. Lactose tolerance, for example, evolved independently in multiple farming populations that kept dairy animals. The ability to digest, Milk as adults provided such a massive nutritional advantage that the gene spread through European and African herding populations in just a few thousand years. That's lightning-fast evolution, detectable genetic change in just a couple hundred generations. Some populations developed genetic adaptations to malaria in regions where agriculture created standing water that mosquitoes loved. Sickle cell trait, thalassemia, G6PD deficiency, genetic variants that provided resistance to malaria at the cost of other health problems. Natural selection making brutal calculations. Better to risk anemia than die of malaria at age 5. There's evidence of selection for genes affecting starch digestion, alcohol metabolism, and immune response to specific diseases. Regional populations were adapting to their new agricultural lifestyles. But, and this is crucial, these weren't major physical changes. Nobody was developing longer arms for hoeing or thicker skulls for grinding grain. The visible dramatic changes that had characterized human evolution for millions of years, those stopped. Why? Because we were changing the wheat instead of changing ourselves. Think about it. Ancient wheat was a wild grass with tiny hard grains that shattered and scattered when ripe, making harvest nearly impossible. Over thousands of years, farmers unconsciously selected for mutant varieties. Larger grains, stalks that held seeds longer, plants that responded better to fertilization. By 5,000 years ago, domesticated wheat looked nothing like its wild ancestor. More importantly, it behaved completely differently. It was a plant designed by humans, for humans, adapted to our needs rather than us adapting to it. The same thing happened with rice in Asia, corn in the Americas, and dozens of other crops worldwide. Every agricultural region developed its own suite of domesticated plants, all of them shaped by artificial selection to meet human needs. We were practicing evolution, just not on ourselves, and it worked. Those modified plants could support far larger populations than wild varieties ever could. This same pattern played out with animals. Wild sheep were aggressive, rangy creatures with minimal wool. Domesticated sheep became docile, stocky, producing massive fleeces because humans killed any sheep that didn't fit that profile. Cattle, pigs, chickens, dogs, all transformed through selective breeding into forms that served human purposes. This was something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth, a species deliberately modifying other species to make the environment more hospitable, instead of evolving to fit the environment. It was evolution by proxy, and it removed most of the selective pressure for physical change in humans themselves. Cold environment? Don't evolve thicker fur, weave warmer clothes from domesticated sheep. Tough food sources? Don't evolve stronger jaws, breed softer grains and develop cooking techniques. Predators threatening your group? Don't evolve to run faster, build walls and domesticate dog for protection. Every challenge that would have driven physical evolution in our ancestors was being solved by technology and environmental modification instead. The irony is almost funny. Agriculture made individual humans weaker, but it made human civilization unstoppable. Those early farmers, shorter and sicker than their ancestors, were building something their ancestors never could. Permanent settlements, accumulated knowledge, specialized labor, eventually cities, writing, mathematics, everything we think of as civilization. All of it impossible without agriculture, because all of it required dense, stable populations, and those populations kept growing. By 5,000 years ago, farming communities had replaced hunter-gatherers across most of the world's productive land. Not through physical superiority, but through sheer numbers and the social complexity that agriculture enabled. The archaeological record from this period shows wave after wave of farmer expansion, moving into new territories, displacing or absorbing hunter-gatherer populations, spreading agricultural techniques and domesticated species to every continent except Antarctica. Some hunter-gatherer populations adopted farming voluntarily, seeing the advantage of reliable food sources. Others were pushed to marginal lands where farming wasn't viable. A few remained isolated enough to maintain traditional lifestyles until modern times. But the trend was clear. The future belonged to farmers, regardless of what farming did to their bodies. By 3,000 years ago, the transformation was essentially complete. The vast majority of humans lived in agricultural communities, their bodies softer and weaker than their ancestors, but their societies vastly more powerful. We had fundamentally changed the rules of evolution. Natural selection still operated, populations still adapted to local conditions, but the primary mechanism of adaptation had shifted from biological to cultural. Instead of waiting for beneficial mutations to appear and spread through populations, we could develop new tools, techniques, and crops in a single generation, then teach them to our children. This was the real revolution. Not farming itself, but what farming represented. The moment when human cultural evolution became faster and more powerful than biological evolution. When we stopped waiting for our bodies to adapt and started making the world adapt instead. Everything that came after, every subsequent chapter in human history, flows from this transformation. We became a species that evolves through ideas and technology rather than through genes and physical traits, and there was no going back. So here's where the story takes its most dramatic turn, because around 300,000 years ago something extraordinary happened. Human brain size reached a kind of plateau, not because evolution stopped working, but because we'd hit what engineers would call an optimization point, the perfect balance between capability and cost. Your brain right now, the one processing these words, weighs about 3 pounds. That's roughly 2% of your body weight, but it consumes 20% of your total energy. 20%. If you're eating 2,000 calories a day, your brain is burning through 400 of them just by existing. That's more than your heart, your lungs, your liver, more than any other organ. It's like running a high-performance computer 24/7 inside your skull. Now imagine trying to make that brain even bigger. Every additional ounce of neural tissue requires more energy, which means you need to eat more, which means you need to spend more time hunting and gathering, which means you have less time for thinking and social interaction. Plus, there's the problem of birth. Human babies already have dangerously large heads relative to the size of the birth canal. Any bigger and human reproduction becomes impossible without modern medical intervention. So evolution hit a wall, a physical wall. The human brain couldn't get much larger without creating more problems than it solved. But here's the thing, it didn't need to. Because somewhere around 300,000 years ago, our ancestors discovered something revolutionary, a hack that would change everything. They discovered that you don't need to evolve new capabilities if you can learn them instead. Think about what that means. A lion is born knowing how to hunt. It's in their genes, their instincts, their physical structure. Change the environment, introduce new prey species, and the lion population has to wait for natural selection to favor individuals with better hunting traits. That takes thousands of generations, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. But a human can learn to hunt anything in a single generation. Teach a child to track deer and they'll track deer. Move to the coast and they'll learn to fish. Travel to the Arctic and they'll figure out how to hunt seals through ice holes. Same brain, same body, infinite adaptability. This is cultural evolution, and it's so much faster than genetic evolution that it's almost unfair. Natural selection works on timescales of millennia. Cultural evolution works on timescales of years, sometimes months. The archaeological record shows this transition with stunning clarity. Around 300,000 years ago, you start seeing something unprecedented in human sites. Not just tools, but different types of tools in different regions. Populations adapting their technologies to local conditions without waiting for their bodies to change. Coastal populations developing fishing equipment. Inland groups refining hunting spears. Desert dwellers creating sophisticated water storage containers, all within a few generations, all without a single genetic change. But the real revolution was still coming, because having the ability to learn isn't enough. You need to be able to transmit that learning. You need language. Not the simple calls and gestures that other primates use, but true symbolic language. The ability to represent abstract concepts with arbitrary sounds. The capacity to talk about things that don't exist, events that haven't happened yet, ideas that exist only in imagination. Nobody knows exactly when this happened. Language doesn't fossilize. We can't dig up ancient conversations, but everything points to a critical threshold being crossed somewhere between 200,000 and 70,000 years ago. The period anthropologists call the cognitive revolution. The first hints are subtle. Burial sites start including grave goods, not just bodies, but objects placed deliberately with the dead. Ochre pigment, shaped stones, animal bones arranged in patterns. This tells us something profound. These people had developed symbolic thinking. They could conceive of death as something meaningful, imagine an afterlife, create rituals to honor their dead. Then, around 100,000 years ago, you start seeing decorative objects. Shell beads drilled with holes for stringing, pieces of ochre with geometric patterns scratched into them. These aren't tools, they serve no practical purpose. They're art, they're symbols, they're evidence of minds that could think about things beyond immediate survival. And then around 70,000 years ago, everything explodes. Archaeologists call it the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, and it's like someone flipped a switch. Suddenly human sites are full of sophisticated tools, elaborate art, complex social structures, cave paintings depicting hunting scenes, religious ceremonies, mythological creatures, carved figurines representing humans and animals, musical instruments, jewelry, evidence of long-distance trade networks moving raw materials across hundreds of miles. But here's what's remarkable. The humans creating this explosion of culture had the same brain size as their ancestors 100,000 years earlier. Same skull capacity, same neural tissue. Nothing about their physical structure had changed. What changed was what they could do with those brains. They had developed what cognitive scientists call theory of mind. The ability to understand that other people have thoughts, beliefs, and intentions different from your own. This sounds simple, but it's actually one of the most cognitively demanding abilities in existence. Most animals never develop it at all. With theory of mind came everything else. The ability to lie and detect lies, to negotiate and form alliances, to teach complex skills by understanding what the learner does and doesn't know, to create elaborate social hierarchies based on reputation rather than physical dominance, to believe in gods and spirits and abstract moral codes. Most importantly, they developed the ability to imagine alternative realities, to think about what might be rather than just what is, to plan not just for tomorrow or next season, but for generations into the future, to conceive of themselves as part of a story extending backward to their ancestors and forward to their descendants. This is where humans became truly unique. Other animals can learn. Some can even teach. But no other species can transmit complex cultural knowledge across dozens of generations, building on previous discoveries to create cumulative culture, technology that improves over time, stories that grow more elaborate, social systems that become more sophisticated. And here's the beautiful paradox. Once this system was in place, physical evolution became almost irrelevant for humans. Why wait for natural selection to give you thicker fur when you can learn to make clothing? Why evolve larger claws when you can craft better weapons? Why develop specialized digestive systems when you can learn to cook and process food? The archaeological record from the last 70,000 years shows humans spreading across every environment on Earth, from the Arctic to the Kalahari Desert, from Himalayan peaks to Pacific Islands, and they did it without significant physical changes. The humans who first settled the Arctic 30,000 years ago had the same bodies as their ancestors who evolved in tropical Africa. They survived not by evolving cold weather adaptations, but by learning to make warm clothing, build insulated shelters, and create reliable fire. Even more remarkably, human brains actually got slightly smaller the last 20,000 years. Not because we're getting dumber, but because we learn to store information externally, in tools, in art, in stories passed down through generations, in written language once that was invented. You don't need to remember everything yourself when you can learn from others. You don't need to figure everything out through trial and error when centuries of accumulated knowledge are available. The brain became more efficient, not by getting larger, but by getting better connected. More neuroplasticity, more capacity for learning and adaptation throughout life. This is the secret that agriculture would later amplify. Humans succeeded not by being the strongest or the fastest, not by having the sharpest teeth or the keenest vision. We succeeded by being the most flexible, the most capable of learning, adapting, cooperating, and imagining. Natural selection still worked on us, but it shifted its focus. Instead of favoring individuals with larger brains or stronger bodies, it began favoring individuals who were better at social learning, people who could pick up skills quickly, who could understand complex instructions, who could cooperate effectively in large groups, who could control their impulses enough to follow social rules. The genes that spread weren't the ones that made people physically different. They were the genes that made people behaviorally flexible, better at language acquisition, more capable of abstract reasoning, more sensitive to social cues and reputation. This is why all modern humans, regardless of where our ancestors lived for the past 70,000 years, are fundamentally the same. A baby born in the Arctic and raised in the Amazon would be indistinguishable from anyone else in the Amazon. A child from the Kalahari could be raised in Tokyo and become completely fluent in Japanese culture. We're all born with the same cognitive toolkit, the same capacity for language, abstract thought, and cultural learning. What differs isn't our hardware, it's our software, the specific knowledge, skills, beliefs, and practices we learn from our particular cultures. And that software can be updated, modified, or completely replaced within a single generation. No waiting for evolution, no genetic changes required. By the time agriculture was invented 12,000 years ago, humans had already been living this way for tens of thousands of years. We had already made the transition from physical evolution to cultural evolution. already discovered that our minds were more powerful than our bodies, already learned that cooperation and knowledge sharing could accomplish things no individual could achieve alone. The agricultural revolution would amplify this pattern to an unprecedented degree. But it didn't create it. The foundation was already there, laid down during those crucial millennia when human brains reached their optimal size, and human culture became the primary mechanism of adaptation. We had become the species that evolved to stop evolving, or rather, the species that evolved to evolve in a completely different way, through learning instead of genes, through culture instead of natural selection, through imagination instead of physical adaptation, and that changed everything. Now here's where the story gets really fascinating, because around 2 million years ago something unprecedented started happening to human evolution. We began outsourcing our adaptations. Think about every other species on Earth. A bird needs to catch fish, it evolves a specialized beak. A predator needs to run faster, it evolves longer legs and more efficient muscles. A mammal moves into a cold climate, it grows thicker fur. Evolution writes the solutions directly into their DNA, into their bodies. This takes hundreds of thousands of years, sometimes millions. But humans, we took a shortcut. Instead of waiting for natural selection to modify our bodies, we started modifying our environment. We began creating external adaptations, tools and technologies that did the same job as biological evolution, but worked on a completely different timescale. Not millennia, but generations. Not generations, but years. Eventually, not years, but days. This is the single most important thing to understand about why humans stopped changing physically. We didn't stop evolving, we just moved our evolution outside our bodies. Let's start with the most basic example, stone tools. Around 3.3 million years ago, one of our distant ancestors picked up a rock and deliberately struck it against another rock to create a sharp edge. This doesn't sound revolutionary, it sounds almost absurdly simple, but this moment changed everything. Because here's what that sharp rock did. It gave our ancestor the ability to cut through tough animal hide without needing the powerful jaws of a hyena. It let them access bone marrow without requiring the crushing bite force of a leopard. It allowed them to process plant materials without evolving the complex digestive system of a gorilla. One simple tool replaced the need for millions of years of specialized physical evolution. And our bodies responded immediately, though not in ways you'd expect. They didn't evolve stronger, they evolved weaker. Or more precisely, they stopped maintaining expensive physical features that were no longer necessary. Over the next million years, human jaw muscles got smaller. Our teeth became less robust. The massive brow ridges that had anchored powerful chewing muscles began to reduce. We were literally losing physical capabilities because we'd externalized them into tools. But we weren't becoming weaker overall. We were becoming more efficient. All that metabolic energy that would have gone into maintaining powerful jaws and massive teeth could now be redirected toward something more valuable. Our brains. The archaeological record shows this trade-off playing out over millions of years. As stone tool technology becomes more sophisticated, human skulls show progressively smaller faces and larger brain cases. We're watching evolution in action, watching natural selection favor individuals who were good at making and using tools over individuals who had strong jaws. Then, around 1.8 million years ago, our ancestors invented something that would accelerate this process beyond anything seen before. Fire. Controlled fire is probably the most important technology in human history. More important than the wheel, more important than agriculture, more important than writing or computers or any of the flashy innovations we usually celebrate. Because fire externalized one of the most basic biological functions, digestion. When you cook food, you're essentially pre-digesting it. The heat breaks down tough proteins and complex carbohydrates, doing chemically what your digestive system would otherwise have to do mechanically and biologically. This meant our ancestors could extract more calories from the same amount of food with less effort. The implications were staggering. First, cooked food meant humans could survive on a much wider range of food sources. Plants that were toxic or indigestible when raw became nutritious when cooked. Tough meats that would have required hours of chewing could be consumed quickly. This dietary flexibility meant humans could colonize environments where they couldn't possibly survive on raw food alone. Second, and more importantly, cooking reduced the energy demands of digestion. The human digestive system is actually relatively small compared to other primates. A gorilla's gut is massive, designed to process huge quantities of raw plant material to extract enough calories. Our guts are compact, efficient, designed to handle pre-processed cooked food. This freed up enormous amounts of metabolic energy. And where did that energy go? Into our brains. The timing isn't coincidental. The earliest evidence of controlled fire use appears around 1.8 million years ago. Brain size in human ancestors begins increasing dramatically right around the same time. Within a few 100,000 years, our ancestors' brains had grown by almost 50%. We had externalized digestion, and natural selection rewarded us by allowing our most expensive organ, the brain, to grow to unprecedented sizes. But fire did something else too. It eliminated the need to evolve cold weather adaptations. Think about Neanderthals for a moment. They lived in Ice Age Europe without fire. Wait, no, that's not right. They had fire. Sophisticated fire management, actually. They could start fires, maintain them, transport them from place to place. Now imagine if they hadn't had fire. Imagine trying to survive European winters with nothing but your body for warmth. Natural selection would have driven them toward developing thick fur coats like woolly mammoths. They might have evolved layers of insulating fat like seals. Their extremities might have shortened to reduce heat loss. Their metabolisms might have shifted to generate more body heat. But none of that happened. They didn't need fur because they had fire and clothing. And that brings us to another crucial external adaptation: clothing. The exact origin of clothing is hard to pin down because organic materials don't fossilize well. But genetic analysis of human body lice, which evolved specifically to live in clothing rather than body hair, suggest humans started wearing clothes somewhere between 170,000 and 83,000 years ago. This innovation completely eliminated the need for environment-specific body adaptations. No species on Earth has the geographical range of humans. We live in the Arctic and the Sahara, in tropical rainforests and high-altitude mountains, in temperate zones and arid deserts. No other mammal even comes close to this diversity of habitats, and we do it all with essentially the same body. The physical differences between a person from Norway and a person from Nigeria are trivial compared to the differences you'd expect if they'd actually evolved to suit their environments. A Norwegian human doesn't have a thick fur coat. A Nigerian human doesn't have specialized heat-dissipating features like an elephant's ears. Why? Because clothing externalized the adaptation. Natural selection no longer needed to modify our bodies to handle different climates. We just changed what we wore. Then there are weapons. Weapons are a beautiful example of external evolution. Humans are apex predators. We sit at the top of the food chain. We hunt and eat essentially any animal we want, from the smallest bird to the largest whale, and we do this without a single predatory physical adaptation. Look at our teeth. Pathetic. Even our canines, the so-called eye teeth that in other predators are enlarged for stabbing and tearing, are barely distinguished from our other teeth. Our jaws can't crush bone. We don't have venom glands. We lack sharp claws. We don't have particularly powerful muscles. We can't run especially fast. By every biological measure, humans should be prey animals, not predators. But we have spears, arrows, atlatls, nets, traps, coordinated hunting strategies passed down through cultural learning. These external adaptations made us the most efficient predators in planetary history. A single human with a rifle can kill an elephant, something that would be impossible for even the most powerful unarmed predator. Ancient humans with nothing but wooden spears and coordination drove entire species of megafauna to extinction. Natural selection never needed to give us fangs or claws because we'd externalized predation into tools, and again, this freed up evolutionary resources for other purposes, mainly cognitive development. Shelter represents another profound externalization. Architecture, even in its most primitive form, eliminated the need to evolve body features for specific environments. Birds that nest in cold climates often have denser plumage. Mammals that live in burrows develop specialized digging claws. Species that inhabit particular ecological niches evolve body plans suited to those spaces. Humans just build different houses. Arctic peoples developed sophisticated insulated structures using local materials. Desert peoples created homes designed to stay cool through passive ventilation. Tropical communities built elevated structures to avoid flooding and improve airflow. Same bodies, different buildings. External adaptation again. Transportation technology continued this trend. For millions of years, human ancestors were pursuit predators. We evolved to run long distances in hot weather, sweating to cool ourselves, wearing prey animals down through sheer endurance. Our bodies still carry the evidence: relatively hairless skin, abundant sweat glands, specialized tendons in our legs and feet, designed for efficient long-distance running. But once we domesticated horses around 6,000 years ago, that particular survival skill became less critical, invented the wheel, even less important, developed automobiles, trains, airplanes, and suddenly the ability to run long distances provides almost no survival or reproductive advantage. In a pre-technological world, the fastest runners, the most efficient walkers, had real advantages. They could hunt more successfully, travel farther to find resources, escape dangers more effectively. Natural selection would favor traits that improved these abilities. But in a world with transportation technology, these advantages disappear. A person with poor running endurance can still hunt, travel, and escape danger by using vehicles. The evolutionary pressure to maintain or improve our running adaptations simply vanishes. Now, this doesn't mean humans have become worse runners in just 6,000 years. Evolution doesn't work that fast for complex traits. But it does mean there's no longer selection pressure maintaining these abilities at peak efficiency. Given enough time, without that selection pressure, we'd probably see these features degrade somewhat. But here's the thing. We're not giving evolution that time, because the pace of technological change is accelerating exponentially. The most recent and dramatic example is medicine. For millions of years, natural selection operated through brutal efficiency. Individuals with genetic vulnerabilities died young, often before reproducing. Individuals with genetic advantages survived and passed those advantages to their children. This is how evolution works. It's not pretty, but it's effective. Medicine short-circuits this entire process. Consider something simple, like poor eyesight. In a hunter-gatherer society, severe myopia is a serious disadvantage. You can't spot predators or prey at a distance. You're more likely to suffer accidents. Your survival and reproductive success would be reduced. But modern humans with terrible eyesight just wear glasses, or contacts, or get laser surgery. The genetic predisposition toward poor vision is completely neutralized by technology. There's no evolutionary pressure to correct it because the technology corrects it instead. The same applies to countless other conditions. Diabetes can be managed with insulin. Infections that would have been fatal are cured with antibiotics. Genetic disorders that would have prevented reproduction can be treated, allowing affected individuals to have children who inherit the same genetic variations. We're not just preventing evolution, we're actively preserving genetic diversity that natural selection would eliminate. And the trend is accelerating. Gene therapy promises to correct genetic disorders directly. CRISPR technology might soon allow us to edit our own genomes with precision. We're approaching the point where biological evolution becomes almost irrelevant because we can make any changes we want directly, deliberately, immediately. This is external evolution taken to its logical extreme. Not just creating tools that replace body functions, but creating tools that modify our bodies directly, bypassing the entire evolutionary process. Smartphones represent perhaps the most recent example of this phenomenon. Their external memory, external communication capability, external navigation systems, external sensors. They expand human capability in ways that would take millions of years to evolve biologically, and they do it in decades. A modern human with a smartphone has access to essentially all human knowledge, can communicate instantly with anyone on Earth, can navigate to any location, can perceive wavelengths of light we're not equipped to see, can record and process information at scales impossible for biological memory. We've externalized cognition itself, and this is why human physical evolution has essentially stopped. Not because we've reached some perfect form, but because we've found a better strategy. Instead of waiting for random mutations and natural selection to slowly modify our bodies over hundreds of thousands of years, we modify our environment and create technologies that serve the same purpose in a fraction of the time. We're still evolving, but we're evolving culturally and technologically, not physically. Our tools change, our knowledge expands, our capabilities increase, but our bodies? They remain mostly the same, frozen in time, waiting for evolutionary pressures that never come because we've externalized every adaptation we might need. This is humanity's true superpower, not strength or speed or any particular physical trait, but the ability to evolve outside our bodies, to adapt faster than natural selection, to change our world instead of waiting for the world to change us. And it all started with one ancestor picking up a rock and striking it against another to make a sharp edge. That simple act set us on a path that would eventually lead to space stations and computers and medical miracles, to a species that conquered the planet not through superior biology, but through superior technology. We stopped changing physically because we learned something better. We learned to change everything else. But here's where the story gets really interesting, where everything we've been building towards starts to click into place. Because while our ancestors were developing bigger brains and better tools, something even more revolutionary was happening. Something that would ultimately matter more than any physical adaptation could ever have. They were learning to work together in ways no other species had ever managed. And this changed everything. Picture a typical group of early humans, maybe 50,000 years ago, not that different from us physically. They had the same basic body plan, the same brain size, the same potential for intelligence. But look closer at the group composition, and you'll notice something strange. There's an elderly woman, maybe 65 years old, her teeth worn down to nubs, her joints swollen with arthritis. In any other primate species, she would have died decades ago. But here she is, sitting by the fire, teaching young girls how to identify edible plants, how to predict weather patterns, how to prepare medicines from roots and bark. She's a walking library of survival knowledge, kept alive by a group that values her expertise more than her ability to gather food. Next to her sits a young man, maybe 20 years old, with a badly healed leg fracture that leaves him with a permanent limp. In the wild, among our ape cousins, he would have been easy prey, unable to keep up with the group, left behind to die. But look at him now. He's become the best toolmaker in the group precisely because his disability forced him to specialize. While others were out hunting, he spent years perfecting his craft. Now, everyone depends on his spear points, his scrapers, his knowledge of stone. There's a woman who's heavily pregnant, 9 months along, moving slowly and carefully. She hasn't been able to participate in gathering expeditions for weeks, but the group feeds her anyway, because they understand something profound. Her contribution comes later, when she'll nurse not just her own child, but help care for others, when she'll add another member to a community that grows stronger with every birth. This is revolutionary. This is unprecedented. This is the beginning of human civilization. Because here's what you need to understand. In every other species on Earth, natural selection operates primarily on individuals. The fastest gazelle escapes the cheetah. The strongest gorilla wins mating rights. The best camouflaged butterfly avoids predators. Your physical capabilities determine your survival and reproductive success. But humans broke this rule, completely shattered it. Through social cooperation, we created a situation where individual physical capability mattered less and less. A weak human in a strong group survives better than a strong human alone. A slow runner who can make fire survives better than a fast runner who can't. A poor hunter who can negotiate alliances survives better than a skilled hunter who alienates everyone. The selection pressure shifted from individual physical traits to social and cognitive abilities, and this changed everything about human evolution. Think about division of labor. In a chimpanzee troop, every adult male needs to be capable of fighting, foraging, and defending territory. Every adult female needs to be capable of gathering food, caring for infants, and escaping predators. There's some variation, sure, but everyone needs a complete survival skill set. Humans threw this out the window. We developed specialization on a scale that would have seemed insane to our ancestors. One person becomes an expert tracker, developing skills that take decades to master. Another focuses on tool-making. Someone else becomes the group's best fisherman. Another specializes in plant knowledge. Someone becomes particularly skilled at mediating disputes, and suddenly you don't need to be good at everything. You just need to be good at something. Something the group values enough to keep you fed and protected while you develop your specialty. This meant that physical traits that would have been fatal in our ape cousins became manageable, even advantageous, in human societies. Poor eyesight. No problem if you're the toolmaker working up close. Weak upper body strength? Doesn't matter if you're the plant specialist. Slow runner? You can be the one who maintains the fire and prepares food while others hunt. The genetic diversity that would have been ruthlessly eliminated by natural selection in other species persisted in humans because our social structures provided niches for almost everyone. And then there's the really wild part. We started caring for people who couldn't contribute at all. Archaeological evidence shows humans caring for disabled individuals going back at least 500,000 years. There's a Homo heidelbergensis skull from Spain, 500,000 years old, showing evidence of severe deformities that would have been apparent from birth. This individual lived to adulthood despite being physically disadvantaged. Someone kept them alive, fed them, protected them. Neanderthal sites show even more dramatic examples. Skeletons with healed injuries that would have required months of careful nursing. Individuals who survived to old age despite disabilities that should have killed them. One famous Neanderthal from Iraq, nicknamed Nandi, had a withered arm, blindness in one eye, and evidence of severe head trauma. He lived to about 40 years old, which was elderly for Neanderthals. Someone cared for him for decades. This is compassion, written in bone. This is empathy, preserved in the archaeological record. This is evidence that our ancestors had developed something no other species possessed: the ability to value individuals for reasons beyond their immediate utility. And this changed the evolutionary equation completely, because suddenly, genes that would have been eliminated from the population survived. Genetic variations that caused disability or disease didn't automatically disappear. Our gene pool became more diverse, not less, because our social structures protected variation instead of eliminating it. But the revolution went even deeper than just caring for the weak. Humans developed something that anthropologists call prestige-based mate selection. And it's absolutely wild. In most mammal species, mating success is determined by physical dominance. The biggest, strongest, most physically impressive males get the most mating opportunities. This creates intense selection pressure for size, strength, and aggression. But humans, weird as always, decided to do something different. We started choosing mates based on social status, personality traits, skills, and reputation. The best hunter might have high status, sure, but so might the best storyteller, the wisest elder, the most skilled craftsperson, the most generous gift giver, or the funniest comedian. Archaeological evidence suggests this started early. Grave goods in ancient burials don't always go to the largest or most robust individuals. Sometimes the most elaborate burials belong to people whose skeletons show no signs of physical prowess. Their status came from something else: leadership ability, spiritual authority, artistic skill, accumulated knowledge. This meant that reproductive success became uncoupled from physical dominance. A physically unimpressive but socially skilled individual could have more children than a strong but antisocial one. A woman valued for her knowledge or leadership could have more reproductive success than a physically attractive but unskilled woman. The genes that coded for intelligence, empathy, communication skills, and social awareness became more important than genes for size, strength, or speed. Human evolution was optimizing for different traits entirely, and then warfare changed everything again. Now, don't get me wrong. Humans have always been capable of violence. Archaeological evidence shows conflicts going back to our earliest days, but the nature of human warfare was different from the dominance fights seen in other primates. When chimpanzees fight, it's usually about individual strength and aggression. The biggest, most aggressive males dominate through physical prowess. But when humans fight, it's about coordination, strategy, and group cohesion. A well-organized group of physically average humans will destroy a disorganized group of physically superior individuals every single time. Coordination beats strength. Communication beats size. Strategic thinking beats aggression. This created selection pressure for traits that enhanced group cooperation rather than individual combat ability. The ability to follow orders, to coordinate attacks, to trust your companions, to suppress your individual fear, and work as a unit. These became more important than personal fighting ability. But perhaps the most important innovation was something that happened entirely in our heads. Something invisible, intangible, but more powerful than any physical weapon. We developed shared beliefs. Somewhere along the line, humans figured out how to use stories, myths, and belief systems to create cooperation between individuals who weren't related to each other. This was revolutionary because it allowed human societies to scale beyond the limits that constrained other primates. Chimpanzees can maintain stable groups of maybe 50 individuals held together by personal relationships and kinship. Beyond that, the group fragments because there's no mechanism to maintain cooperation between strangers. But humans, through shared beliefs, created groups of hundreds, thousands, eventually millions of individuals who cooperated as though they were family, even though they'd never met. How? Through stories, shared origin myths that created common identity, religious beliefs that established shared moral codes, tribal affiliations that extended kinship bonds to strangers, trade agreements that created mutual obligations, shared languages that made strangers comprehensible. Archaeological evidence shows this happening relatively early. By 40,000 years ago, maybe earlier, human groups were creating symbolic artifacts that marked group membership. Particular styles of tools, decorative items, burial practices that were consistent across hundreds of miles. These weren't just random variations. These were markers of shared identity, symbols that said, we belong together, we share beliefs and values. And these shared belief systems created trade networks that spanned continents. Archaeological sites show raw materials that came from hundreds of miles away. Obsidian from volcanic regions appearing in settlements that had no local source. Seashells appearing hundreds of miles inland. Particular types of stone tools appearing across vast regions, suggesting either movement of people or exchange of goods and knowledge. This trade was crucial because it meant individuals didn't need to be self-sufficient anymore. You didn't need to be good at everything or even most things. You just needed to produce something others valued, and you could trade for everything else. A coastal group could specialize in fishing and shellfish gathering, trading preserved seafood for inland resources. A group living near obsidian deposits could specialize in tool-making, trading finished tools for food and other goods. Groups with particular plant knowledge could trade medicines for things they couldn't produce themselves. This meant that physical adaptations to specific environments became less important. You didn't need to evolve biological resistance to coastal parasites if your trade network could supply you with inland food sources when necessary. You didn't need to evolve cold weather adaptations if you could trade for furs and better shelter materials. The environment was still shaping human evolution, but indirectly, through social and technological adaptations rather than physical changes. And here's the truly mind-bending part. All of these social innovations, division of labor, care for the disabled, prestige-based mate selection, organized warfare, shared beliefs, trade networks, they all reinforced each other. Each innovation made the others more effective, creating a feedback loop that accelerated cultural evolution while slowing physical evolution. The more we cooperated, the less we needed individual physical capabilities. The less we needed those capabilities, the more genetic diversity could persist. The more diverse we became, the more specialization was possible. The more specialization occurred, the stronger our groups became. The stronger our groups, the more we could care for weaker members. The more we cared for everyone, the more genetic and behavioral variation survived. We had created a system where the group success mattered more than individual physical fitness, where social bonds were stronger than biological imperatives, where shared imagination could accomplish what genetic adaptation never could. We had, in essence, hacked evolution itself, found a way to survive and thrive without waiting millions of years for natural selection to optimize our bodies for every new challenge. And this, more than anything else, explains why humans stopped changing physically. We didn't need to anymore. Our social structures had become our evolutionary adaptation. Our cooperation had become our superpower. But this created new vulnerabilities too. Vulnerabilities that would shape human history in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. Because once you've built a survival strategy based on social cooperation, you become dependent on that cooperation in ways that can be terrifying. But there's another force that stopped human evolution in its tracks, and it started way earlier than you might think. Picture this. It's 30,000 years ago. A woman in what is now France is giving birth, and something goes wrong. Breech presentation. The baby's positioned feet first instead of head first. In the natural world, without intervention, this would almost certainly be a death sentence for both mother and child. Natural selection would do its work. The genetic traits that led to this complication would be removed from the gene pool, simple as that. But here's what actually happened. The woman's group had a midwife, not a trained medical professional in the modern sense, but an experienced older woman who had seen many births, who had learned certain techniques through trial and error and teaching. She knew how to turn the baby. She knew how to position the mother. She knew which plant extracts might help with the pain, and which ones might speed the contractions. Mother and child survived, and with that single intervention, natural selection had just lost a little bit of its power over humanity. Now multiply that one birth by thousands, millions, billions over the course of human history. Every time someone intervened to save a life that nature would have taken, we chipped away at evolution's grip on our species. The archaeological record shows evidence of medical intervention going back incredibly far. Neanderthal skeletons from 60,000 years ago show healed injuries that would have been debilitating. Broken bones that were set and splintered. Infections that were somehow treated and survived. One famous Neanderthal skeleton from a wreck shows evidence of multiple serious injuries, including a crushed eye socket and a withered arm. Yet this individual lived for years after these injuries, into what would have been old age for their species. Someone was taking care of them. Someone was sharing food with an individual who couldn't hunt. Someone was protecting a vulnerable member of the group instead of abandoning them to die. This is medicine at its most fundamental level. Not surgery or pharmaceuticals, just the decision to care for the sick and injured, instead of letting nature take its course. And it's been part of human behavior for hundreds of thousands of years, but it's also been interfering with natural selection for just as long. Think about what natural selection actually does. It removes individuals with disadvantageous traits before they can reproduce. Genetic variants that make you more susceptible to infection, less able to heal from injury, more likely to have complications during childbirth. All of these get weeded out generation by generation, leaving only the most robust, most disease-resistant, most physically capable individuals to pass on their genes. Except humans decided that wasn't acceptable. We decided that the weak deserved to survive just as much as the strong, and we developed increasingly sophisticated ways to make that happen. Ancient skulls show evidence of trepanation, deliberate holes drilled into the skull, and here's the wild part, the bone shows signs of healing, meaning people survived this procedure. We don't know exactly why they did it. Maybe to relieve pressure from head injuries, maybe for ritual purposes, maybe they believed it released evil spirits causing headaches or seizures. But whatever the reason, they were performing brain surgery with stone tools, and some patients lived. By the time of ancient Egypt, medicine had become remarkably sophisticated. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating from around 1600 BCE, but copying even older knowledge, describes surgical procedures, anatomical observations, and treatments for dozens of conditions. They had specialized doctors for different body parts. They performed cataract surgery. They set broken bones with splints and used moldy bread as a primitive antibiotic, accidentally discovering the precursor to penicillin thousands of years before Fleming. The ancient Greeks and Romans took it further. They developed hospitals, public health systems, sanitation infrastructure designed to prevent disease. They understood that contaminated water spread illness even if they didn't know about bacteria. They practiced quarantine during plague outbreaks, accidentally inventing epidemiology. All of this meant that traits which would have been fatal in the natural world were becoming survivable. Poor eyesight, not great for a hunter-gatherer who needs to spot prey from a distance, but manageable in an urban environment where you can specialize in close-up craft work. Weak immune system, potentially deadly in a small band constantly exposed to the elements, but much less so in a city with healers and medical knowledge. Difficult childbirth anatomy, would have removed your genes from the population in one generation, but human midwifery meant your daughters could inherit those same traits and survive to have their own children. We were accumulating genetic variation that natural selection would normally eliminate, not because these variations were advantageous, but because we'd figured out how to compensate for them. Then came the real revolution. The germ theory of disease in the 1860s changed everything. Once we understood that invisible microorganisms caused infections, we could finally fight them systematically. Antiseptic surgery meant operations that would have been death sentences became routine. Childbed fever, which had killed countless women in the days after giving birth, virtually disappeared when doctors started washing their hands. Vaccination, pioneered by Jenner in 1796 but truly scaled up in the 19th and 20th centuries, meant diseases that had killed millions for thousands of years could be prevented entirely. And then came antibiotics. Penicillin, discovered in 1928 and mass-produced by the 1940s, was nothing short of a miracle. Infections that would have been fatal, tuberculosis, pneumonia, sepsis, bacterial meningitis, could now be cured with a simple injection. Mortality rates plummeted, life expectancy soared. But here's what nobody talks about. Every person saved by antibiotics is someone who might have died under natural selection. Every genetic variant that makes you slightly more susceptible to bacterial infection gets to stay in the gene pool. Every immune system weakness that would have been fatal in 1850 is now just a minor inconvenience requiring a prescription. We're not eliminating the evolutionary pressure of disease, we're reversing it. We're actively preserving genetic diversity that natural selection spent millions of years trying to remove. Modern medicine has taken this to extremes that would have seemed like science fiction just a century ago. Insulin for diabetics means a condition that would have been universally fatal now has almost no impact on reproduction. Caesarean sections mean pelvic anatomy that would have made childbirth impossible is no longer a death sentence, and those anatomical traits get passed to the next generation. Eyeglasses mean vision problems that would have been seriously debilitating for a hunter-gatherer barely register as an inconvenience in modern life. We've got prosthetic limbs that let amputees run marathons. We've got cochlear implants that give hearing to the deaf. We've got medication that controls conditions from epilepsy to schizophrenia. Conditions that would have made survival and reproduction extremely difficult throughout most of human history. Premature babies that wouldn't have survived even 50 years ago now regularly live normal, healthy lives thanks to neonatal intensive care. Genetic conditions that would have been fatal in childhood can now be managed with therapy and medication. Organ transplants mean a failing heart or kidney doesn't have to be a death sentence. Every one of these interventions is another way we've defeated natural selection. Another way we've said that genes don't get to determine who survives and who doesn't. The numbers are staggering. In 1900, life expectancy at birth in the developed world was around 47 years. Today it's over 80. Infant mortality has dropped from about 165 deaths per 1,000 births to fewer than 6 per 1,000 in many countries. Maternal mortality during childbirth has decreased by over 99% in the past century. All those people who would have died under the old rules of natural selection are now living, thriving, having children, passing on their genes. And here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a little uncomfortable. We're conducting the largest evolutionary experiment in human history, and we have no idea what the results will be. Without natural selection weeding out genetic variants that increase disease susceptibility, are we becoming collectively weaker? Are we accumulating mutations that would have been eliminated under natural conditions? Some geneticists think yes. Studies suggest that slightly deleterious mutations, ones that have small negative effects but not enough to be lethal, are indeed accumulating in human populations, especially in the past few thousand years. But here's the counter-argument. Who cares? If we have the technology to compensate for genetic weaknesses, does it matter if those weaknesses become more common? If everyone needs glasses, we'll just make more glasses. If diabetes becomes more prevalent, we'll just produce more insulin. We've essentially outsourced evolution to technology. This raises profound questions. Are we still evolving at all, or have we stepped outside the evolutionary process entirely? Have we replaced biological adaptation with technological adaptation? And if so, what does that mean for our future as a species? Some researchers worry about what might happen if our technological civilization ever collapsed. Would humans without modern medicine be able to survive? Have we become so dependent on medical intervention that we've lost the biological robustness our ancestors had? Others argue this is exactly what human evolution was always leading toward. Our big brains didn't evolve to make us physically stronger, they evolved to make us smart enough to overcome our physical limitations. Medicine isn't defeating evolution, it's the ultimate expression of human evolution. We evolved brains capable of understanding disease and developing treatments. That's our evolutionary advantage. The truth is probably somewhere in between. We're still evolving, just not in the ways we used to. Natural selection still operates, just much more weakly and in different domains. Maybe we're now selecting for traits like ability to navigate complex social systems, intelligence, adaptability to rapidly changing technological environments. But one thing is certain. For the first time in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth, a species has gained the power to say no to natural selection, to decide that survival of the fittest is a rule we no longer have to follow. We looked at the cruel mathematics of evolution, the way it preserved some genes and eliminated others based solely on reproductive success, and we decided to write new rules. Whether that's humanity's greatest triumph or a dangerous gamble with our evolutionary future, well, that's a question we're still trying to answer. Here's the uncomfortable truth about human evolution. It hasn't stopped. Not even close. But you'll never see it happening. Not in your lifetime, not in your children's lifetime, not even in the lifetimes of your great-great-great-grandchildren stretching forward 100 generations. And that's exactly why we think we've stopped evolving. Because here's the thing about evolution. It's slow. Not kind of slow. Not inconveniently slow. Glacially, cosmically, mind-numbingly slow. The kind of slow that makes continental drift look like a sprint. Think about it this way. Modern humans have existed for roughly 200,000 years. That sounds like forever, right? Your entire life feels long. Your grandparents' lives feel like ancient history. 200,000 years should feel like an eternity. But in evolutionary terms, 200,000 years is nothing. It's a blip, a sneeze, a commercial break in the multi-billion-year documentary of life on Earth. To understand why, we need to talk about generations. Evolution doesn't measure time in years. It measures time in reproductive cycles, in generations passing traits to the next generation. That's the fundamental unit of evolutionary change. For humans today, a generation is roughly 25 to 30 years. That's the average age when people have children who then grow up to have their own children. So 200,000 years represents about 8,000 human generations, 8,000 opportunities for natural selection to work its magic, for beneficial mutations to spread, for populations to adapt to their environments. Now 8,000 generations sounds like a lot. And it is, if you're trying to develop something relatively simple. Lactose tolerance in adult humans, which we'll talk about in a minute, evolved in about 400 generations. Eye color variations, skin tone differences, these can emerge relatively quickly. But here's what 8,000 generations isn't enough time for. Major structural changes, complete redesigns of body systems, the kind of dramatic physical transformations that make fossils from different species look wildly different from each other. When paleontologists look at the fossil record, the really dramatic changes, the stuff that makes you go, wow, that's a completely different animal, that typically takes hundreds of thousands of generations, sometimes millions. The evolution of whales from land mammals took about 10 million years. That's roughly 400,000 whale generations. The evolution of birds from dinosaurs? 150 million years. Countless generations of tiny modifications accumulating into flight. So when we look at humans and say, we haven't changed in 200,000 years, what we're really saying is, we haven't changed dramatically in a relatively brief evolutionary moment. The timescale of human observation is completely mismatched with the timescale of evolutionary change. We're trying to watch continental drift happen during our lunch break, but, and this is crucial, evolution is still happening. It's just happening so slowly that it's invisible to us. Like trying to watch a tree grow by staring at it for an afternoon. The tree is growing, cells are dividing, nutrients are being transported, the whole biological machinery of growth is operating, but you'll never see the branches extend in real time. Modern humans are evolving right now in ways both subtle and profound. We just can't see it because we're trapped in our own temporal perspective. But genetic analysis can see it, and what it reveals is fascinating. Take lactose tolerance. For most of human history, all humans were lactose intolerant after childhood. This makes perfect sense. Mammals produce milk for their infants. Once you're weaned, you don't need to digest milk anymore, so why maintain the metabolic machinery to process lactose? Better to shut down those genes and save energy for other things. But then, roughly 10,000 years ago, some human populations started keeping cattle. Suddenly, there was a massive nutritional advantage to being able to digest milk as an adult. You had access to a rich source of calories and protein that didn't require killing the animal. Cows became walking refrigerators, producing fresh food on demand. In populations where cattle herding became central to survival, a genetic mutation that kept lactase production active into adulthood became incredibly advantageous. Individuals with this mutation could extract more nutrition from their environment. They were healthier, had more children, and passed on the lactose tolerance gene. Within about 400 generations, roughly 10,000 years, lactose tolerance became dominant in European, some African, and Middle Eastern populations. Today, about 35% of the global population can digest milk as adults. That number was nearly zero 10,000 years ago. This is evolution happening at warp speed, by evolutionary standards, and it happened so recently that we can track the genetic changes, identify the specific mutations, even map how the traits spread geographically. But from a human perspective, 10,000 years still feels like ancient history. None of us were alive to watch it happen, or consider high-altitude adaptations. Populations living in the Himalayas and the Andes have been dealing with low-oxygen environments for thousands of years, and they've evolved distinct genetic solutions to the problem. Tibetan populations carry genetic variants that increase blood flow and improve oxygen delivery to tissues without raising red blood cell counts to dangerous levels. Andean populations evolve different variants that increase hemoglobin concentration and lung capacity. These aren't cultural adaptations, they're genetic changes, written in DNA, passed from parent to child, and they emerged in just a few thousand years, maybe 200 to 300 generations. Natural selection working in overdrive because the selection pressure was so strong. In high-altitude environments, better oxygen processing means better survival, more successful reproduction, more copies of the beneficial genes in the next generation. The same thing is happening with disease resistance. Populations that have historically been exposed to malaria show higher frequencies of sickle cell trait, which provides some protection against the disease. European populations descended from people who survived multiple plague epidemics show genetic variants affecting immune function. Asian populations have distinct immune system genes reflecting their ancestral disease environments. Every one of these is evolution in action, natural selection favoring certain genetic variants over others, populations adapting to their environments generation by generation. But it's all happening on timescales too long for individual humans to perceive. Then there's genetic drift, which is evolution without natural selection. Random changes in gene frequency just because populations are finite, and inheritance is probabilistic. Think of it like flipping a coin. Even if the coin is perfectly fair, you might get 7 heads in a row just by chance. That doesn't mean the coin is biased. It's just random variation. The same thing happens with genes. Even without any selection pressure, without any survival advantage, some genetic variants become more common, while others become rarer just because of random reproductive luck. Maybe the individuals who carry a particular gene happen to have more children. Maybe they happen to move to a region where they form a large portion of the breeding population. Over hundreds of generations, these random effects accumulate, creating genetic differences between populations that have nothing to do with natural selection. We can see this happening in modern human populations. Regional genetic variations are emerging, not because they're being selected for, but just because populations are somewhat isolated and drift is operating. Certain genetic markers become more common in Iceland, others in Japan, others in isolated African populations. Given enough time, thousands of generations, these random differences could accumulate into more visible variations. But here's where it gets really interesting. We're now discovering that evolution isn't just about DNA sequence changes. There's another layer of inheritance called epigenetics, and it operates on much faster timescales. Your DNA is like a massive instruction manual for building and operating a human body. But epigenetics is like the system of bookmarks, highlights, and annotations that determine which parts of the manual get read and when. Environmental factors, your diet, your stress levels, even your parents' and grandparents' experiences can modify these bookmarks without changing the underlying DNA sequence. These epigenetic modifications can be passed to your children. Not permanently, not in the DNA level way that we traditionally think of inheritance, but transiently, for a few generations. This means that environmental pressures can influence gene expression much faster than traditional evolution could alter gene sequences. Studies of populations that experience famine show epigenetic changes that persist for 2 or 3 generations. Children and grandchildren of famine survivors show altered metabolism, different disease susceptibilities, changes in how their bodies process nutrients. The DNA sequence hasn't changed, but the pattern of gene expression has been modified by ancestral experience. This raises a profound question. Is evolution happening faster than we thought, through these epigenetic mechanisms? Or is this something else entirely, a parallel form of adaptation operating alongside traditional genetic evolution? Scientists are still figuring this out, but it suggests that the timescale problem might be more complex than we realized. Some changes might be happening on generation-to-generation timescales, too fast to be traditional evolution, but too slow to be visible to individual observers. We're in this weird middle ground where we're blind to both the glacial pace of genetic evolution and the multi-generational dynamics of epigenetic change. And that brings us to the real problem, our perception. We measure time in human lifespans, 70, 80, maybe 90 years if we're lucky. Evolution measures time in reproductive generations spanning thousands or millions of years. We're using the wrong units, asking the wrong questions. It's like trying to understand plate tectonics by watching a mountain for an hour. The mountain is moving, it's rising or eroding, responding to massive geological forces operating deep beneath the surface. But you'll never see it move because geological time and human time operate on completely different scales. The same applies to human evolution. We are changing, selection pressures are operating, beneficial mutations are spreading. Genetic drift is creating population differences. Epigenetic modifications are responding to environmental pressures. The entire machinery of evolution is running at full speed. We just can't see it because we're trapped in our own temporal perspective, watching a process that unfolds over timescales that dwarf human civilization itself. So when someone tells you humans have stopped evolving, they're not exactly wrong. They're just looking at the wrong timescale. Check back in 100,000 years, then we'll have something to talk about. So here's the question that keeps evolutionary biologists awake at night. After 7 million years of human evolution, after that desperate 117,000-year bottleneck that nearly wiped us out, after spreading across the globe and becoming the dominant species on the planet, are we done? Has human evolution just stopped? The answer is complicated. Because evolution hasn't stopped, it's changed direction in ways that would have been completely incomprehensible to our ancestors. We're not evolving physically the way we used to, that's true, but we might be on the verge of the most radical transformation in human history, one that makes everything that came before look like a warm-up act. Let's start with a conventional view. According to most evolutionary biologists, natural selection has essentially stopped working on humans, at least in the traditional sense. Remember, natural selection requires three things: variation in traits, differences in survival and reproduction based on those traits, and heritability of the advantageous traits. For millions of years, these conditions applied perfectly to humans. People with better eyesight survived longer, had more children, passed on their good vision genes. People who could run faster escaped predators, lived to reproduce, spread their athletic genes. Over thousands of generations, this process refined human bodies into incredibly sophisticated survival machines. But something shifted, especially in the last few thousand years. Medicine started keeping people alive who would have died in the past. Agriculture made food abundant enough that physical strength mattered less. Social structures and laws protected the weak, ensuring that survival wasn't just about physical fitness anymore. By these measures, the intense selective pressures that shaped our ancestors have largely disappeared. The playing field has been leveled. Almost everyone in modern society survives to reproductive age, regardless of whether they have perfect vision, incredible strength, or optimal disease resistance. Does this mean evolution has stopped? Not exactly. It means the rules have changed. Because here's the thing about human evolution in the 21st century. Natural selection might be weakening, but we've replaced it with something potentially far more powerful: intentional selection. For the first time in history, humans have the ability to directly edit the genetic code that determines what we are and what we might become. CRISPR technology, developed just over a decade ago, allows scientists to cut and paste genes with unprecedented precision. We can literally rewrite the instruction manual that built us. Right now, this technology is mostly being used for medical purposes, correcting genetic disorders, eliminating hereditary diseases, treating cancers that were once death sentences. But the potential goes far beyond fixing what's broken. We could theoretically enhance normal human traits, increase intelligence, improve physical capabilities, extend lifespan, modify our bodies to survive in environments that would kill us today. This isn't science fiction. It's happening now, just slowly and carefully. In 2018, a Chinese scientist named He Jiankui announced he had created the first genetically edited human babies, twin girls modified to be resistant to HIV. The international response was outrage, condemnation, criminal charges. But the genie was out of the bottle. The technology exists. Someone will use it again, probably soon. And once the ethical barriers fall, once society decides that genetic enhancement is acceptable, human evolution will enter a completely new phase. Imagine this scenario. It's 50 years in the future. Prospective parents visit a genetics clinic before conceiving. They're shown a menu of options: enhanced disease resistance, guaranteed; optimized metabolism for longevity, standard package; increased cognitive processing speed, popular upgrade; physical modifications for appearance, completely customizable. This isn't far-fetched. The technology to do most of this already exists. We're just deciding whether we should. If this happens, and many scientists think it's inevitable, human evolution will split into two tracks: natural evolution, which will continue slowly in populations that don't have access to or choose not to use genetic modification, and engineered evolution, which could progress at whatever pace we decide. This engineered track won't be bound by the slow grinding process of natural selection. It will move at the speed of human innovation and desire. But genetic engineering isn't the only force that might reshape humanity. Climate change, ironically, might be recreating some of the intense selective pressures our ancestors faced. As the planet warms, as weather patterns shift, as coastal regions flood and agricultural zones migrate, humans will face environmental challenges we haven't experienced in thousands of years. In some regions, heat tolerance might become a crucial survival trait. In others, the ability to survive on limited resources or resist new disease strains might determine who thrives and who struggles. The difference is that this time, we won't adapt slowly over hundreds of generations. We'll adapt using technology, medicine and engineering. We'll build climate-controlled cities, develop new food sources, create medical treatments for heat stress and emerging diseases. We'll modify our environment to suit us rather than waiting for natural selection to modify us to suit our environment. But some adaptation might still be genetic. Populations living in extreme conditions might develop heritable traits over centuries. We're already seeing this in real time. Studies of communities living at high altitudes show genetic changes occurring within just a few generations, adaptations to oxygen-poor environments that would have taken much longer in our evolutionary past. Then there's the most radical possibility, the one that makes genetic engineering look conservative by comparison: brain-computer interfaces, neural implants that directly connect human consciousness to digital systems. This technology is already in early stages. Companies are developing interfaces that let paralyzed patients control computers with their thoughts, allowing blind people to see through camera feeds connected directly to their visual cortex. But these are just the beginning. The ultimate vision, pursued by tech companies and futurists, is full integration between human minds and artificial intelligence. Imagine downloading information directly into your brain instead of learning it through study. Imagine communicating with others through direct thought transfer, no language required. Imagine backing up your memories, your personality, your entire consciousness to digital storage. At what point does this stop being human evolution and start being something else entirely? When does Homo sapiens become Homo digitalis? Some scientists think this transition is not just possible, but inevitable. They argue that biological evolution is too slow, too random, too limited. Our bodies are made of fragile meat that breaks down, wears out, dies. But information, consciousness transferred to silicon and code, could persist indefinitely. It could be copied, modified, upgraded. It could expand beyond the limitations of a 3-pound organ encased in bone. This raises a fascinating question. If consciousness can exist without a biological body, is it still human? If we upload our minds to computers, are we evolving or going extinct? The answer might be both. But not everyone believes these radical transformations are our destiny. Some evolutionary biologists argue that cultural and technological evolution has permanently replaced physical evolution, and that's perfectly fine. They point out that humans have been using external tools to overcome biological limitations for hundreds of thousands of years. Clothing replaced thick body hair. Weapons replaced large teeth and claws. Written language replaced the need for perfect memory. We've always been a species that evolves culturally faster than we evolve physically. From this perspective, the future of human evolution isn't about changing our bodies or uploading our minds. It's about continuing to develop better tools, better social systems, better ways of organizing knowledge and cooperation. We'll remain biologically human, but we'll keep expanding what that means through collective intelligence and shared technology. The wild card in all of this is space colonization. If humans establish permanent settlements on Mars, on orbital habitats, on the moons of Jupiter, we'll face selection pressures unlike anything on Earth. Reduced gravity, high radiation, isolated populations with limited gene flow. These are exactly the conditions that drive rapid evolutionary change. Within a few thousand years, humans born and raised on Mars might develop distinct physical characteristics. Taller, thinner bodies adapted to low gravity, enhanced radiation resistance, possibly even different reproductive strategies suited to small isolated populations. This raises the possibility that humanity might diverge into multiple subspecies or even separate species, exactly what happened after the genetic bottleneck 900,000 years ago. Earth humans, Mars humans, orbital humans, each adapted to their specific environment, except this time the divergence would be accelerated by intentional genetic modification and extreme environmental differences. We could see the kind of speciation that normally takes hundreds of thousands of years happen in just a few millennia. Or maybe not. Because unlike our ancestors, we have global communication, rapid transportation, and interconnected economies. Gene flow between populations, even populations on different planets, could be maintained deliberately. We might decide that staying unified as a single species is worth the effort, actively preventing divergence through careful management of genetics and reproduction. Which brings us to the deepest question of all. What does it mean to be human if we're consciously directing our own evolution? For 7 million years, our ancestors were shaped by forces beyond their control. Climate, predators, disease, competition for resources. They had no choice in what traits got selected, no say in what direction evolution took them. They were passengers on a journey they didn't choose and couldn't understand. We're different. We can see the mechanisms that shaped us. We're developing the tools to reshape ourselves. We can choose what we want to become, but should we? And if we do, what should we choose? These aren't just scientific questions, they're philosophical, ethical, even spiritual questions. They force us to confront what we value about being human. Is it our biological form, the specific arrangement of DNA that makes us Homo sapiens? Or is it something less tangible, our consciousness, our capacity for love and creativity and wonder? If we modify our genes, are we still human? If we upload our minds, do we still exist? The truth is, we don't know. We're standing at a crossroads unlike any our species has faced before. Every choice we make now about genetic engineering, about artificial intelligence, about space colonization, about the relationship between biology and technology, will determine what humanity becomes, or whether humanity, as we understand it, continues to exist at all. But here's what we do know. We are the descendants of survivors, of the 1,280 individuals who made it through that desperate bottleneck, of the populations that adapted to every environment on Earth, of countless ancestors who faced challenges that seemed insurmountable and somehow, impossibly, endured. We carry their genes, their resilience, their capacity to adapt and overcome. Whatever comes next, whether it's genetic modification, digital consciousness, space colonization, or something we haven't imagined yet, we'll face it with the same fundamental qualities that brought us this far. Curiosity, creativity, cooperation, and an almost reckless determination to survive and thrive no matter what the universe throws at us. The future of human evolution isn't written yet. We're writing it now, one choice, one innovation, one discovery at a time. And that's both terrifying and exhilarating. Because for the first time in the history of life on Earth, a species gets to decide its own destiny. The question isn't whether we're done evolving, we're just beginning, but this time we're holding the pen. So here we are, at the end of this journey through millions of years of human change and adaptation. And if you've been listening carefully, you've probably noticed something remarkable. The story we've been telling isn't really about how humans stopped evolving. It's about something far more interesting. We evolved the ability to stop evolving physically by evolving culturally instead. Think about what that means for a moment. Every species on Earth is locked into the same basic evolutionary game. Change your body to fit your environment or go extinct. Giraffes got longer necks to reach high leaves. Polar bears got white fur to blend into snow. Cheetahs got faster to catch prey. But humans? We looked at that game and decided to change the rules entirely. We didn't grow fur when we moved into cold climates. We killed animals and wore their fur. We didn't develop specialized digestive systems for different foods. We invented cooking and agriculture. We didn't evolve wings to fly or gills to breathe underwater. We built airplanes and submarines. We outsourced our evolution to our brains, to our tools, to our collective knowledge. And that is the most radical evolutionary innovation in the history of life on Earth. Your body, the one you're lying in right now as you drift towards sleep, is the product of an incredible journey. 3.5 billion years of continuous evolution, unbroken since the first cell divided in some ancient ocean. Millions of years of your ancestors fighting, surviving, adapting, reproducing against impossible odds. You carry genes that survived the genetic bottleneck 900,000 years ago, when humanity was reduced to just over 1,000 breeding individuals. Genes that were refined by 117,000 years of near extinction. Genes selected for intelligence, cooperation and adaptability under conditions that would make our modern struggles seem trivial. You have a skeleton perfectly balanced for upright walking, a feat of engineering that took millions of years to perfect. Hands capable of both power grip and precision manipulation, allowing you to wield a hammer or thread a needle. A brain 3 times larger than it should be for a primate your size, capable of abstract reasoning, symbolic thinking, and imagining futures that don't exist yet. And perhaps most remarkably, you have the capacity for culture, the ability to learn from others, to build on previous generations' discoveries, to transmit knowledge across time without changing a single gene. That's what makes us different, not that we stopped evolving. We're still evolving right now. Selection pressures are still operating. Genes are still being passed on differentially based on survival and reproduction. But the pace of cultural evolution has become so fast, so powerful, that physical evolution can't keep up anymore. We adapt in years or decades to challenges that would take other species millennia. We are, in a very real sense, evolution's experiment in consciousness taking control of its own destiny. We're not subject to our environment anymore. We shape it. We're not limited by our biology anymore. We augment it. We're not trapped in the present anymore. We plan. We dream. We imagine possibilities that don't exist yet, and then make them real. And all of this happened not because we're somehow outside of evolution, but because we're the ultimate product of it. Natural selection created brains capable of overriding natural selection. Evolution produced beings capable of directing their own evolution. That's the beautiful paradox you can rest with tonight. You're both the endpoint of an ancient process and the beginning of something entirely new. You're unchanged. Look at yourself in the mirror. Go ahead, picture it. The shape of your face, your hands, the way your body is built. Now here's the mind-bending part. If you could somehow stand next to a human from 200,000 years ago, you'd look almost identical. Same height, roughly, same bone structure, same brain size. You could swap clothes and nobody would notice the difference. But look around at the world you live in. Smartphones, airplanes, cities with millions of people stacked in buildings that scrape the sky. We've invented antibiotics, split the atom, and landed robots on Mars. We've transformed this entire planet. We've changed everything except ourselves. That's the mystery we're going to unravel tonight. Why did humans stop changing physically? What happened to evolution? Because here's what doesn't make sense. Every other species keeps adapting to their environment. Fish develop new colors. Birds evolve different beak shapes. Bacteria become resistant to our drugs in real time. Evolution never stops. So why did it stop for us? 200,000 years. That's how long modern humans, Homo sapiens, have existed, with basically the same body we have today. Sure, there are small variations. Some populations adapted to high altitudes, others developed different skin tones. But fundamentally, we're frozen in time. A human from the late Stone Age would have the same physical capabilities, the same strength, the same senses, the same brain structure as you do right now. Yet in those same 200,000 years, we went from hunting with stone-tipped spears to hunting for Wi-Fi signals. Something broke the rules of evolution. Something made us different.